I have been allying with and endeavoring to understand this amazing character for almost 20 years now. This is the elderberry. This happens to be a variety that is a American dominant with a little European. Here's an American one behind me. All sorts of characters in between, many named varieties, including seedlings. Over the years, I feel like I'm starting to just scratch the surface of understanding what it means to manage these plants from a pruning standpoint. And so the focus of this video is the elderberry plant and various styles of pruning in order to manage their growth, how they respond to that, the pros and cons, how American and European respond differently. So I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive with my humble opinion, my humble understanding of working with this plant over the years. I'm really open to hearing other people's ideas too. And since I started with this plant right behind me, I will continue on with this. This is a phenomenally, abundantly, happily growing Scotia cultivar of elderberry. This happens to be a variety that I think is predominantly American with a little bit of European in there. And what you're looking at, this is a theme I really want to pick up and focus on in this video, is the idea of vigor and health and overall vitality in these plants. This is a plant that was cut very, very hard this season. I would have liked to have cut it flush to ground entirely. I just ran out of time and bandwidth. We processed dormant cuttings for sale in the winter and early spring. You can see a couple shoots that did not get pruned, but the areas where it was pruned really hard, it has rebounded phenomenally well. It is late May right now, and this is a huge amount of growth for so early in the season. In fact, you can see a couple of woody stems here. I would describe as what I've done as a pollarding cut. So gone through and cut at around waist to chest height throughout. So here is a woody stem of last year's growth headed back to right about here. And then all of these extremely vigorous green shoots are this year's growth. And a common feature of American dominant or pure American elderberry is that new shoots have flowers in the middle. So you can cut them very hard, and the regrowth will not only have growth, but it will also be able to establish flowers and therefore fruit. Something I have learned over the years is that European elder, pure European, so Samdal, Samel, Alesso, there's, I'm sure, tons, Hashburger, there's a bunch of different named cultivars of pure European, which are not extremely hardy in our area in central New York State. Those plants, the pure European, cut hard, the new growth is vigorous, but it will not necessarily establish flowers and fruit. And in fact, they kind of want to be a little bit more like a tree rather than a dense shrub like this Scotia behind me. You can see immense vigor in all of this new growth. So everything you see is brand new since the growing season started. And that includes some of these shoots that are almost 4 or 5 feet tall from the ground. And if I pan a little to the left, you can see an elder that, you know, hey, it's alive, it's doing okay, it's got its growth happening. This is a cultivar named Wildwood. I feel like this could have done incredibly well to have been cut super hard somewhere right in here and have the same sort of vigorous regrowth as the Scotia. But since I didn't have the time and bandwidth, here it is a little bit more lean, a little more sparse. I suspect if I don't cut this plant pretty hard in the next few years, it will start to decline precipitously and maybe even die. So I just showed some examples there of a really hard cut or decently hard cut on our Scotia elderberry and the non-cut on the Wildwood and the differences in vigor. I want to take a little bit of a look through here. This is a block of Marge. Some have been cut flush to ground, so a hard coppice cut, and some have been left alone. What do they look like? Marge is an elderberry that, to the best of my understanding, is truly an intersectional between American genetics and European genetics, and that seems to track. It has a relatively early flower that's quite large, huge fruit that are on the sweeter side, and that makes sense for a more European vibe, but also has pretty good disease resistance and cold hardiness. It's a favorite plant of ours in this landscape. And looking at here, This is a marge that was cut not at all, or negligibly. I cut just a little bit here or there. In fact, a lot of the pruning that happened in this particular block is in the spirit of releasing light to this solar panel. I talked about this funky homemade array based on scavenged road sign poles. That's a different topic. You're welcome to explore that if you want. But these are some marge plants that were in the way of that, and so I coppiced them really hard. Coppicing, for those of you that are new to that idea, is to take a woody perennial plant and cut it more or less flush to ground. It's not exact, precise, but decently. You can see these are all the stems that were growing last year, and I cut them hard, very, very close to ground. And so here we are in late May. This is entirely new growth for this growing season. Marge being a European and American, but definitely European influence. Almost certainly this one will not fruit or not flower and fruit this year, and that's okay. This one, which was cut super hard to ground, coppiced flush to ground, extreme vigor, extreme amount of beautiful vegetation and growth. This will also most likely, most certainly not flower and fruit this year. But this one, which was only cut back kind of halfway, you can see some of these. I left a couple woody stems that were not in the way of the solar array. Those will be able to flower and fruit. And since we have so many elderberries in the landscape, I'm really happy with this concession. I'm going to cut them back as needed in order to release light to the solar. We'll manage these on a 1 or 2 year rotation cycle now with pretty intense pulses so that they don't block light into there, and they will be able to fruit once or twice here or there, and then the plants to the west will be able to flower and fruit copiously without blocking solar gain. These are some neat examples of extremely reactive plants to cutting regimes. So cutting hard when they are dormant is profoundly, deeply stimulating to well-established elderberry plants, both European and American, but particularly the American types. So there's the completely uncut marge, the 2 or 3 coppiced, really tightly cut, and then the half cut, half not cut, full release for the solar array, and an interesting ability to observe some response in those plants over there. In our chicken extension area, I'm going to link here to the video that talked about the establishment of this. So this whole area was established by dormant cuttings in the spring of 2020. We are in the spring of 2024, so this is 4 years later. It is like obscenely, phenomenally loaded with life. It's just off the charts what's happening in here. But I'm going to keep my focus on the elderberries and look at these first. And so here's a row of Scotia again. And to be honest, I think I would have done well to actually cut these much, much harder. I did some horizontal or some lifting pruning to allow a little bit more light and air into these white currants to the west of those elderberry. It looks like there's some beautiful cow parsnip growing in here as well, which we'll leave for now. It's an incredibly useful plant to have around. I know some people hate it. I tend to like it. But I did some pruning on the Scotia in order to get more light into them. If I were to do it again, I actually think I would have gone through and cut them a lot lower. The white currant could have used a bit more light and water access. This is it kind of hanging out down in the understory here. And yes, the Scotia responded really nicely to this pruning cut, but if I had done a more uniform cut, a coppice flush to ground, the response in vegetation would have been way more vigorous. But it's kind of a hybrid blend of cutting just enough in the dormant season to allow more light and air, and for us to be able to access and harvest the white currants and the black currants. But we could have gone a little bit harder and the plants would have responded more positively, I think. It, to me, is still kind of mind-numbing that from dormant sticks, this entire planting of willow and elderberry and currants took about an hour and a half for Juan and I to establish as dormant cuttings in April of 2020. And it is full to the point of overflow. I probably need to do some mid-season cutting, some harvesting of green manure and feeding that to other plants. It's a little bit overwhelming in a wonderful and beautiful way. how in a wet site, slow to drain, high clay content, cuttings established in the spring, dormant window, nice hardy field ready cuttings can just explode in a northern climate. So it's walking down a little bit further of these 4-year-old, 5-year-old Scotia cuttings. They will flower and fruit profusely this year. I'm thrilled to be able to offer to local folks the ability to come and harvest flower to dry for medicine and fruit a little bit later in the season, and lament a little bit the lack of the hard cut in order to make sure the currants underneath have their needs met. But it's all working out. But something I want to identify here is a little further on is pure American genetics. Sorry, it's a little hard to walk through here. I have super coarse debris to keep the chickens from being able to dig the soil apart. Here is a block of Bob Gordon, which is a, I believe, pure American genetic line. And these are varieties that I think would have done very well to have been cut much, much harder. I see senescence starting to happen. They're getting a little bit more thin and weak. These have been in here for a few years, and if they were cut harder, I think they would have rebounded with a lot more intense vegetative vigor, a lot more density of growth, and it would have been lower, which would have allowed a little bit more light to these black currants. I think what tends to happen with elderberry in particular, definitively, in particular with American dominant or American exclusive elderberry genetics, is that a non-pruning approach. You just say, well, let them grow in the landscape. They will sucker and spread a little bit, and they feel like they just decline in that scenario. It is the hard cut in the late winter, early March, early April, depending on your climate, before the growth gets underway. Those hard cuts that stimulate extreme vigor and regrowth that keep them juvenile and alive. I'm not that interested in pruning plants in order to be aggressive about, I gotta maximize crops and give me the highest yield, I want the best ROI. But I am interested in managing plants for keeping diversity open. So these currants in here, I want them to have a good chance too. And so there's a compatibility of intercropping elderberry with other shade-tolerant plants, like an understory of honeyberry, an understory of raspberry, understory of your annual greens crops, your kale, your spinach, your lettuces in the summer months, and cutting these back pretty hard for their sake too. Hard cuts when they are dormant for American elderberry genetics confers a rejuvenation, a literal interpretation of that term, that I think is both functional and really supportive of their long-term health. Without it, you can imagine them declining and dying. I've had that happen of 10-year plants where I've never cut them. Let's just see what happens. They've died. I am so interested to hear from people in the comments, to read from people in the comments. What are your experiences? Just to be absolutely crystal clear in what I'm sharing, I'm still learning as I go. We've been working with these for about 20 years, a little less than, and I feel like I'm just starting to learn. Maybe when I am in my 70s or 80s, I'll have something a little bit more intermediate or advanced to say. But for now, these are some observations of a person really intimately interested in the amplification of these plants intersecting with the needs of other plants that are planted among them, and how that all may work. Let me know what you agree with, what you profoundly and deeply disagree with. I'm interested to hear all of it and share your notes. And also, just a gentle reminder that in cool, moist climates, in the dormant season, you can establish absolute, brilliant, beautiful forests of massive carbon sequestration and wind reduction and privacy and medicine and yield with twigs that are jammed in the ground. This whole thing took less than an hour to plant 4 years ago. Kind of blows me away, and I'm hoping it's exciting and stimulating for folks that want to take a lawn and have it turn into this. And our chickens love it. That's another video for another time. Thanks for watching.